Okay, here we are. Let's go. Oh my God, we have a great show today because if you've ever watched any shows, like currently my husband and I are watching a program, it's a Netflix show called Merlin. And it's based, back in the times of Merlin and, King Arthur, and there's castles, and it's really, really fascinating. Well, my next guest today, we have Marie Powell, and she's writing a series of books that are based on her tours that she had of castles in Wales. Was that correct, Marie?
Well, they're set there. Yeah, set in various castles in Wales that would have been the castles of the Welsh princes. So
Okay.
it's set in 1282, 1284 Wales during the time of the last invasion by Edward I, aka Longshanks, and it tells the story of two siblings who basically pledge their magical gifts to save their people from the ruthless army of Edward I, Longshanks, with a little help from the last true Prince of Wales after his murder. So it's fantasy.
Okay.
Yes, it's definitely a medieval fantasy.
Yeah, that's cool. So. Now, did you ever have any interest in this prior to going on the tours? Like, did it ever enter your mind?
Well, I was a big fan when I was a kid of like the Once and Future King, which is the main story where we get most of our information from now. T.H. White, the main story of King Arthur that we know in the 20th and 21st centuries. It wasn't really foremost in my mind, though, until I began to look around. I basically went to Wales because my grandfather's Welsh. Was Welsh, and I never knew him. Like my grandparents were all dead by the time I was born. I'm the youngest in my family, and so I was a little obsessed with them all. Grandparents that you don't know, right? That had strange and interesting lives, I guess. When I was a kid, my dad was the one who always read to me, and so I was always hounding him for information about his family and where they were from and all that. And so he would try and tell me stories about my grandfather, but during the time when my grandfather was alive, I guess nobody really asked him anything because nobody really knew anything about him. So when I got older, when I was in my 40s and I had two kids of my own and I wanted to kind of pass along information, I had to basically figure it out on my own. So I put two and two together and figured he probably came from North Wales, because he married a woman who was from northern England, and it made sense to me that somehow that would work. So I set up a trip to North Wales, and my idea in going was just to basically walk in his shoes, see what it was all about. My dad had always told me that his father told him that not to go to Wales because it was they had destroyed it. It was all coal mines and it was horrible and all of this, right? So when I got there and it was like green and beautiful, it was a shock, and we went, my kids and I, around to the different castles that I had booked us to go to, thinking these were, Welsh castles, right? Carnarvon, Conwy, Bulmeris, the ones you see online were the ones that I wanted to take the kids to. And as we got in there and did, the guided tours, and we had to pay to get in, like a fairly hefty fee actually to go and see these castles. And get guided tours around them and, shop in the little shops and whatnot. I realized that they're actually English castles created to subjugate the Welsh people. So that was not what I expected. But we had rented a sheep farm because I thought that would be fun for the kids. And the sheep farm was near a place called Dolwyddelan. And Dolwyddelan is in Gwynedd, which is one of the big, Welsh provinces, I guess you could say. They're not provinces, they're counties and whatnot. But near where we were staying, about 5 kilometers down the road, was a castle of the Welsh princes. That's how it was built. So we decided we'd go, drive there and see it. And we got to this castle, and like there was nobody anywhere. We drove up, there was no cars, no people, nobody to take my ticket that I had purchased online. And we went in. What you're showing there is Raglan, so that's a different one. This was Dolwyddelan. But anyway, we went into the castle, and as we were walking, it was gorgeous. Like you walk around it and there was a waterfall. It was very pristine and very quiet. And there were these signs, though, that had people falling off of rocks, right? And so it's kind of like enter at your own risk. We took that to mean, and we went up there. And as we were looking in, we looked at the castle, at the ruin of what was left there, the big tower, and the door of it was up in the first floor. It wasn't in the main floor like the regular English castles, like that one that you're showing there. It was actually on the first floor. So, and there was a sort of a rickety set of steps up to it. So we, climbed up these steps and went in, and we weren't even sure we could get in the door because there was literally nobody anywhere around, no little shops or anything like that, like you see at the English castles. And we went in, and around the area, the little kind of cozy inside of this little castle, there was placards set up, right? And the placards told the story of the fall of Wales in 1282, 1283, and the losses that the Welsh people had suffered in their way of life and their like they basically lost. They had a system of law from 900 on, and they lost their own law. It was replaced by English law. They lost the ability to use their own language, especially in town overnight. If they were in the towns, the walled cities that Edward created after he took over Wales, they could actually be killed for speaking Welsh in the town after 5 p.m., for being there after 5 p.m. And so on. But they had to report to the towns constantly, so it interfered with their, rural way of life, the way of life that they had prior to the incursion of Edward into North Wales. And I don't know, I guess we walked up into the upstairs part where there's a wall walk around, and we looked out over the valley of this beautiful area. And I started to kind of imagine what it must have been like to be surrounded by 10,000 soldiers. It's like, in comparison to the big English castles, it's quite tiny, and would have been more of a fort in a sense than what you would normally think of as a castle, because it was one big tower at the time when the invasion occurred. And it was interesting. The history of Dol with Ellen is also that was the first place that Edward had used camouflage. His wife and her ladies apparently had created white uniforms, like white coats or cloaks for the men to wear over their armor, so they could sneak in through the snow, so it had this really incredible sort of history to it. And I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about what it must have felt like when they fell, And the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to know more about that. And I knew that my grandfather was a Welsh speaker. He had billed himself as a Welsh first speaker on the 1916 census when he first came to Canada. And so that was interesting for me. And especially finding out that they had actually had their language taken away from them. And just from the 1990s on, have they actually had the right to use their own language again. And it's come back to the level that basically you have to speak Welsh now. You have to have Welsh certification if you want a government job there. Your kids go to school in Welsh. The signs are in Welsh first, all the highway signs and whatnot. So kind of a striking ability to come back, I guess you could say, from a situation where they were almost outlawed in their own country, almost refugees in their own country. And so that's kind of where this came from. I started reading about it. I started doing some more research about it. And the more I found out, the more I wanted to know. And ultimately, that's where this book series came from.
Well, that's fascinating.
This is one of the ones. These are mostly the ones that Beaumaris, Conwy, all of these are the ones that Edward created to subjugate the Welsh. The original Welsh castles were basically, demolished. And there were 22 royal courts of Wales at that time. They're called llys. And there were areas where noble Welsh people would have, noble Welsh families would have had their family life. They were kind of rural areas, though. They weren't, like the English were castle livers, castle dwellers, but the Welsh were rural people. and there at least would have been a longhouse, more that nature, than it would have been stone, So they were easy, I guess, to take over and completely erase. In fact, today, the archaeological digs that are there, they found one of the 22 Welsh Llys that were all around North Wales in 1282, 1281, shall we say.
And how many years ago did you go there? I mean, that this all started.
We started to go there, I think 2006 was the first time we went.
Okay, so it's been about 15 years since you start. So this idea was brewing, and then how long after you first visited did you decide to go ahead and write? And then after that, then how long did it take to actually publish your first book of the series?
That was it. Was shortly after I got back, I wrote the very first scene in the book, Spirit Sight. I journal, so I was journaling one morning, and I had done. I'm also a reporter, photographer, so I had done a journalist. So I had done a series of articles and talk tapes for the CBC and that on this fellow here who used to live in East End, who trained hawks and took in hawks after they had been injured or whatever, and tried to train them back to life. So I had that on my mind, and I had all this weird information about whales that I didn't know about and that I was just finding out about at that time. And I wrote the scene. And then I started to try and work on the book, and I realized that I wasn't good enough to write the book. So I went back. So I went back to UBC. I applied to UBC, got in, which was great, to do a MFA in creative writing. And that's where I began to work really on the book. I started out with a short story that, to try and kind of get in the mood of it, right? And that was this first version of the book was my thesis project. So that would be 2011, roughly.
Okay.
When I finished that.
How did you come up with the title, Last of the Gifted?
Well, that was later. So at the time, I just called it Hawk because that was its working title. And I actually had it published in 2015. There was a version of this published as Hawk by Five Rivers Press here in Canada, which is a small independent press. And it didn't do very well. I didn't know what I know, and I didn't know then what I know now, shall we say, whatever. Anyway, so about 3 years later, I took the rights back, and I had it, and I just kind of held on to it. I was kind of devastated, I must admit, because it was a little bit of a heart project for me. It had a relationship to my family and to, family trips that we had taken and all this research that I had done. And I joined a group called the Creative Academy for Writers, which is out of BC. And I had met them on a retreat that I took to try and work on this book. And I just felt really fortified by the group and the community of writers that was part of that group, that is still part of that group. And I began to work on it a little more seriously. And I had a chance to apply for a government grant here in Saskatchewan. And so I did that. And I got it. And it was like, oh no, now I have to write the book. So I had to take the book I had to take the book that was and turn it into the book that is. So partly I did a huge brainstorming session with a bunch of colleagues of mine through the Creative Academy to come up with the title. It took a while. It actually threw around a bunch of different titles. And eventually I liked The Last of the Gifted. I liked the way it sounded. And it is the premise of the book. Like, I was trying to explain what the book was about, and one of the members of the Creative Academy said, well, you just said it, Last of the Gifted, right? I went, oh, right. And so that's,
And sometimes it's right in front of our face.
It's true. I was saying it. I just couldn't hear it, I wasn't hearing it in my head, right?
Yeah. Well, I love that. It's interesting. I want to go back to, so you had, first was Last of the Gifted, Spirit Sight, and then the next book, Last of the Gifted, Water Sight. So now what is the water sight, the spirit sight, like what is the next one, and how are you coming up with those subtitles, I guess? Are those the subtitles of the
Those
book?
are the titles. The series is Last of the Gifted. So the first one is about Hugh, who is the boy who is basically a warrior in training in 1282, 1283 Wales. And he can control the minds of animals, birds and animals. That's his sort of gift. And his sister Catherine can see the future in a drop of water, right? So the first book follows, mostly it's driven by Hugh. Both of them are in it. It's a double point of view series, the duology of these two books. Basically, when the prince is slain, Hugh is there and he sees the Prince of Wales murdered. And his gift allows him to meld with the prince's spirit. And then he's holding the spirit of this very fierce and charismatic Prince of Wales in his head, right? And that begins, they begin to work together, the three of them, to try and fight back against the invading English. And it's sort of their job to try and protect the prince's brother, who is going to try and become the Prince of Wales. He never actually manages to do it. So I wanted to follow the history to a certain extent, even though there's very, very little known. What happened was when Edward I was finished invading Wales, he basically destroyed all the records that he could find. He destroyed all the Welsh records. So there was there is really no information from the Welsh side of things. There's a few, the 4 or 5 different chronicles, but who knows how correct they are, and they seem to contradict each other, right? Quite a bit. And his own records, if he kept them, they no longer exist. So where the armies were, when the castles fell, how they fell, and how his own castles began to be built, even, is not really recorded. He was very interested in, Edward I was very interested in seeing himself as the return of the, Prince Arthur, or King Arthur, pardon me, and in eradicating all the ideas about the Welsh princes, who were not royal princes. The idea of the word that is prince in Welsh actually means principal citizen. It's not royal prince. So it was much more, it's a very different way of life, and people don't know much about it, and definitely didn't know, because as I was researching this, more and more was coming to light, because they were just regaining the ability to look at this information from their own perspective and regaining control of, their own narratives, shall we say. So more and more has come out as I've been working on the books. And so even from the first time that the publication that I had in 2015 to the one I have now, I've changed quite a bit. And I ended up, actually through the grant that I got, I was able to hire a historical editor, shall we say, a historical reviewer, and Danielle Cybulski, who is from Ottawa. She's actually from Canada, but she has a specialty in medieval and a specialty in Wales. So that particular time period of Wales, she had written about quite a bit. She calls herself the 5-minute medievalist. So her idea is to make the medieval way of life more understandable for us today, right? And so I wanted that, and I wanted her really badly, and I was able to get her to work with me on making sure that I had the history accurately enough. There's the time period, so you want to make sure that you have things that make sense to that time period. But there's also Welsh, which is gone, right? The whole idea of the Welsh way of life, which we don't know much about in that particular time period. So it's a lot of reading between the lines of things and speculating what might it have been like. So very easy for me to move in with my fantasy ideas, right? With my speculative bent, shall we say, as a writer, and fill in gaps, right, about what we know and how it might have happened. And like I tell you, the best thing that people can say to me after they've read the book is that either I could really see it, which I love, because it's fantasy, right? But also the idea that it makes sense. That could have, I want people to kind of, before they catch themselves and realize that obviously kids could not, mind meld with animals and see the future in a drop of water. Really, I want them to think that maybe they could.
Yeah,
maybe
and I love
that happened this way.
That's one thing about different fantasies. How they're written is I love it when I read something and then I go see the movie and I'm like, oh, I like the book so much better, right? Because you can, your imagination is taking over and you're deciding what the words mean to yourself, and you're painting the picture in your own head. And then when you see it in a movie, it's from their interpretation of what they read. So I think sometimes we see something different when we're reading it than we're actually seing it. This is cool. I'm going to show you. Oh, go ahead. I
was going to say, I'd be happy to find out what they could see in a film of these books. People are already saying that, this should be a movie. And I'm like, yes, it should be. Yes, tell someone.
Yes, I know. And that's how these things happen. A movie called Wishman, which is the story of the founding of the Make-A-Wish Foundation. It
Oh yeah,
happened just like that. It was like, has your story ever been told? No. Okay, let's tell it. So literally
yeah,
that's what it was. It's 5 years. It took over 5 years. I'm an executive
yeah.
producer for that film. But it's
Cool.
interesting how that, things happen because somebody says, oh, that should be, and then someone else says, yeah, okay, let's make it happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, yeah.
so what I'm showing you here, this is a castle also. And this was what really fascinated me about what you're doing here, is because I'm doing an event in this castle.
Oh,
Now,
cool.
yeah, now this is obviously a modern day castle, and this is in California. So it looks a little different, than the I won't show that one, but then the castles, the medieval times, but still it's so cool because there's a castle in California. So we're going to do an event at this venue. I just think it's going to be so fascinating and a lot of fun to do.
For
But
sure.
I just wanted to show that because I think it's cool that different cultures will try to adapt, or adopt what other cultures have done. And so
Yes.
here in California, we're trying to this particular castle trying to adopt, some of that medieval environment, but pull it into today. And so I think it's a lot of fun. It's just a VRBO, like what you call it, vacation rental by owner,
Oh
is
yeah.
is what it is. And so we're just renting it, and we're going to use it as a venue for one of our events coming up. So that's super
I think
exciting.
that sounds fascinating. I mean, and you're right. That is how these Welsh castles of the Welsh princes were actually created because of all the fighting. I mean, they were fighting with the English for 200 years over this one
Yeah.
little patch of land, right? So a lot of these castles were created defensively, and so you can imagine that all of these rural people would have been coming like as the army was coming through. And you're talking about with Edward's army, and it was a lot of people who would have been mercenaries coming in. So there might have been around 10,000 troops coming through. This is a really tiny area of land. Like it's very small Wales, and North Wales was even smaller. Like it's so they had already backed them up into North Wales by 1282, and then they invaded, and it was like the amount of guys walking across the field at you. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it would have been incredible. But these castles were all mainly created in the 1200s, earlier in the 1200s, as they were fighting, as they needed them. And a
Yeah.
couple of the castles were created by this particular Llywelyn, the last Prince of Wales, defensively, and so yeah, I mean, you can just imagine what it would have been like, and how events would have happened there when you're walking around in that kind of. You'll love it, like that kind of atmosphere really lends itself to your imagination in terms of what might and might not have happened.
Right, right. And I'm picturing us having like a night or something, at the event. And you just never know. That's like you said, your imagination can run wild because you have a different type of environment. And then
Mm.
that just opens up for you, it opened up, the writing of this series of books. So what's the next one? Do you have that? Are you starting on it? What's going on
Yeah.
with the next one? What's it called?
Well, I'm thinking what happened was with Watersight, the second book in this series, is that tells the story of Catherine, his sister, or at least she's the driving force of it. Again, it's dual point of view all the way through. But it feels, I think, to most readers at the end of it as though that has a particular arc to it, But there is more to be told because there's a lot that happened after 1283. The war ended, but the adjustment went on, shall we say. It took a while to actually subjugate the Welsh, which is why he needed 13 great big stone castles. So there's a period of time between 1284 and actually right up to 1301 when things were still happening. And I want to be able to carry the story over. So I'm actually doing a related series. I'm not going to touch. I was going to write book 3 of this one and keep it going that way, but I do think this one has its own little arc and feels good to me, where I have them at the end of this horrible war.
Yeah.
So I don't want to do more with Last of the Gifted, so I'm going to create a related series that takes these characters on further. So my two gifted characters, as well as some of the other ungifted characters that form the ensemble, shall we say, of these
Okay.
two books. It's much more. It's kind of British in orientation, I guess, because it is kind of an ensemble. There are characters that would be supporting cast essentially in the story of these two who need their own story told.
Do you get
To me, anyway.
do you get like an emotional connection to your characters?
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, my last name is Powell, which is in Welsh Apul. So it's like Hugh is my granddaddy's granddaddy. You know what I mean? I mean, you know what I mean? Like I kind of right from the beginning when I knew what his name was, which I knew right away, I had that sort of connection to him. Like he was an ancestor, only not obviously because I'm not like magical. I wish I was,
You are.
Well, anyway, I have a whole, family history for these two characters, but there's also a lot of people who would have been involved with them at the time, who would have helped that happen, and who did in my books at least help that happen. Some of them are historical, and some of them are not. They're totally invented, right? So both of those sets of characters I want to tell a little bit more about. And, like one of my favorite historical characters, as it turns out, is Elizabeth de Ferrers, who was the wife of David, the brother who should have been the next Prince of Wales, who actually was drawn, quartered, and the first nobleman to be mercilessly killed for treason, for losing a war. And it's kind of like the Scottish story that happens, 50 years later. This is basically, or 30 years later, this is basically happening in Wales in 1282, 1283. And his wife simply disappears. No idea what happened to her after his death, except that, she was a landowner, and we think we know where she's buried, and she's buried quite a bit after that. So she lived on. So I kind of want to visit what happened to her. And one of my characters who is with her at this moment, who gives me an in there, and David, when he was captured, had 6 girls with him, 2 boys, his own 2 sons, one of his legitimate daughters, and 5 or 6 maybe of his illegitimate daughters with him. They were traveling together. They were living together. And also he had his brother's child as well. So he had a lot of kids with him when the English caught up to him and took him prisoner and ended up, like I say, killing him mercilessly in a, execution kind of style. And these kids just disappear. Like we know where Llewellyn's daughter ended up. We know where David's daughter and his legitimate daughter ended up. But there's the other 5. What happened to them? Right. And so there's lots of story there to tell that nobody, knows but me.
I could see how you could easily go down a rabbit hole, and just keep going. So I have a final question for you. Somebody watching right now, let's say they're interested in writing fantasy. And so what would be a recommendation for you of where to start?
Well, reading, for one. I mean, reading all the fantasy that we have right now, and it's a huge, really, field. It's, maybe not as huge as fiction, right? But definitely start reading fantasy, and take some workshops, because I definitely think that it helped me to go back and get my MFA. And I've taken lots of workshops since then, and mentorships and things like that. So, I mean, all of that is really useful. If you want to write in a field, though, you need to read in that field, right? So that's what I would say. There's lots of books about how to do it, like Orson Scott Card's, how to write science fiction and fantasy, which is a really good one. There are lots of books that will help people, do that as well, right? But if it's at all possible, take some workshops and maybe join a community of writers like I did. I would highly recommend something like the Creative Academy for Writers, which is, I think we have 1,000 members all across the world now. But there are lots of communities like that starting up online, and it's COVID. We can connect really easily online, right?
Yeah.
It's like almost second nature now to have everything done in webinars and, over Zoom and over StreamYard and things like this. So, the sky's the limit, basically, if you want to learn to write right now, or if you want to practice. Learning to write, we all can write, assuming that we're literate, by the time we're, I don't know, 10 or 11, you can write a story usually, right? You have to from school, they make you.
Right.
But if you want to pursue that, and get good at it, then you have to practice it, right? So read, write, write. That's
Practice, practice,
basically how you
practice,
get
right?
better. Yeah, that's basically
Yeah.
how you do it. And having these communities of writers who are facing the same things as you is really, to me, invaluable. Like, I'm not alone out here, right?
Yeah.
Because it's hard. It's not in like I say, with mine, sometimes you have to start over, for various reasons. The first publishing company actually went under too. So, I mean, I took my rights back, but that entire publishing company is not publishing that way anymore. So, and this is the times we live in, right? It's like things are transient a little bit more than they used to be. So having a community of people going through that and being able to network that and being able to just talk about that, like sharing that is really, I think, incredibly invaluable for people.
Definitely. I love that. That's great advice. And so go to mariepowell.ca.
Yep,
Check out,
CA for Canada.
CA for Canada. That's right. Not .com, not .com, .ca. Then look for that Last of the Gifted series of books. Go buy those books, read those fantasies, medieval times. Get yourself back in the 1200s, and what it's like to be, in Wales in the 1200s in the medieval times. And then also, while you're at it, please go over to YouTube and subscribe to Women Action Takers. Click that subscribe button and click that bell so that you're notified when we go live with one of our interviews. I'm doing lots of interviews of authors. I'm so excited about it because every author has a different story of how they got started and why they're writing the stories they're writing. But this is hopefully to inspire and encourage you to take those steps to become an author yourself. So Marie, I want to thank you so much for being here today. I love it. I absolutely love what you're doing. And you've really got me pumped up about our castle event that we're doing. But, even though it's in California, it's still a castle. And so it excites me to no end, So thank you so much. And everybody, again, go to mariepowell.ca and get Last of the Gifted, her series of books. Marie, thank you so much for being here today. I truly appreciate you.
Thank you. It's been great. Thanks.
Have a good day, everybody.